The House voted down a temporary measure yesterday that would have supplied money for government operations until November 18th. The Senate can only take up that legislation after House approval. And now to live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
S. Beeman, Senior Pastor of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Wilmington, Delaware.
Let us pray. God of grace and God of glory, as this great hall prepares to open for another session of deliberations, we humbly submit our minds, energies, gifts, and graces to you, that we may be men and women sensitive to the concerns of a nation in great expectation. Use the collective resolve of our United States Senate as your instrument, bringing wholeness and peace in an age where injury, indifference, uncertainties, and deficiencies swirl as an immobilizing specter. Show us a glimpse of your radiance. Remove all doubts and fears, liberating and inspiring to hope and possibilities become a living reality. We are forever yours, and we will be forever faithful. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 22, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
Majority leaders recognized.
I would yield to my friend, the junior senator from Delaware.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Leader Reid. I rise simply to give honor and gratitude that this morning our opening prayer was offered by the Reverend Dr. Sylvester Beeman of AME Zion in the east side of Wilmington, a great voice for justice in my home state. I think it is a critical and important part of our nation's tradition that we begin every session of the United States Senate with prayerful reflection. I'm thrilled that today he's able to be joined by his wife, Renee, a registered nurse, and to be able to comment for a moment that Reverend Dr. Beeman, born in Niagara Falls, New York, who started his mission work and his service in Hamilton, Bermuda with his wife, early on saw the challenges of HIV/AIDS and the risks and opportunities for worship and for mission that this pandemic provides to our community. He's been with us now 19 years in Delaware, and the two of them have been recognized far and wide in our state and region for the Beautiful Gate Outreach Ministry, which they have launched. I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who first said most tellingly that it is the charge of ministry to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And Pastor Beeman, through his leadership, his vision, his compelling sermons, and his personal example, in partnership with his wife, Renee, have provided exactly that sort of challenging and effective leadership, that great and prophetic voice for our community in Wilmington, Delaware. And, Mr. President, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have his prayerful reflections begin our deliberations here today. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for an hour. Republicans will control the first half, and the majority will control the final half. Following morning business, Senate will resume consideration of H.R. 2832. Later today, the Senate will complete action on the GSP and TAA bill. There will be up to 5 roll call votes in relation to the amendments and passage of this bill. I'll work with the Republican leader to set a time that's convenient to do that. I think more importantly, Mr. President, now that we've arrived in agreement at how to move the trade adjustment assistance out of here, is what's going to happen. Excuse me. In the House. Last week, something all too rare these days happened here in this chamber. We had some bipartisanship. 10 Republicans joined Democrats in voting to give the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the money they need to fund their important operations for the foreseeable future. Their bill would have jeopardized the agency's ability to help Americans affected by tragedy put their lives back together. That is what the House did. The House, what they did last night was so wrong. Mr. President, we passed a bill a few months ago that would take care of funding for the rest of this year, from October 1st to October 1st. Rather than doing what we had agreed upon, and the American people saw us work for months to agree upon, they reneged on that deal. They tried last night to send a continuing resolution for a few weeks, and they attached to it, which they shouldn't have attached anything to it because we had already agreed on all that, attached to it a very, very unfair FEMA funding matter. To show how spiteful they were, we've done great things in this country with doing things with modern vehicles. I had an energy summit at the end of August in Las Vegas, and they had all these electric cars lined up that they could show us. This is a result of the money that we have given here, taxpayers' money, to stimulate that part of our manufacturing sector, and it's worked out great. It's been wonderful. As Steny Hoyer, one of the Democratic leaders in the House, said, what the House did is try to legislate away 53,000 jobs. They took money that was in the pipeline to do more of those electric cars and other kinds of new vehicles. They took that money and stripped it away. They applied that towards something we haven't done around here, and that is fund emergency situations around the country. And to rub salt in the wound, they not only took that, $1 billion worth, but they took $500 million worth and just rescinded it, wiping out jobs, not applying it to the deficit, just doing it, I guess, to show that they're in control of the House. But that fell apart last night. It fell apart because Republicans and Democrats would not support that issue. Now, we don't know what they're going to do over there today. All kinds of rumors floating around, and we don't know. I haven't spoken to the Speaker or the Majority Leader over there. I haven't talked to them. But all kinds of rumors as to what they might do. They might try to send that back to us again. But the one thing I heard loud and clear, and my colleagues have to understand that, the Republicans have announced in the House that they may be in session this weekend. I hope that's not the case. I've spoken to the Republican leader here. If they send us something, we'll do our very, very utmost to move as quickly as we can on that, to take action on whatever they send us. But I want to send this message to them. They should not renege on the agreement that was legislated here just a few short weeks ago. That is, funding government for the next year. We've agreed upon that. And whatever they send us, they should just send us a continuing resolution until we work on getting the appropriation bills done. Send us a continuing resolution with nothing attached to it. If they disagree with what we did over here, they have over in the House side our bill, which passed here on a bipartisan basis. If they don't like that, send us back something else. We think that the overwhelming support of the nation is for something that we did, but don't tie it to the CR. That's simply not the right thing to do. We're going to be alert and wait for the House to act. We really are at an impasse here, not because of what we're doing, but because of what they're doing. And we'll wait and see what action they take. It's extremely important that they act as quickly as they can. We know that we had scheduled next week to be off. We hope we can do that. We have an important holiday next Wednesday. That is the reason that we're taking next week off. but I look forward to working with my colleagues here in the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, to move forward as quickly as we can.
Mr. President. The Republican leader is recognized.
Over the past week, President Obama has been traveling around the country trying to set a record for the number of times he can say the words, "Pass this bill right away." The number of times he can say it actually in a 5-minute speech. And today he'll bring his act to a 50-year-old bridge that connects my own state of Kentucky with Ohio. Now, the purpose of this visit is perfectly clear. The President's plan is to go out to this bridge and say that if only lawmakers in Washington would pass his second stimulus bill right away, then bridges like this one would get fixed, and that the only thing standing in the way of repairing them is people like me. Well, I would just like to make a couple of points about all of this. First, I find it hard to take the President's message all that seriously when his own communications director is over at the White House telling people he's no longer interested in legislative compromise, and when the leaders of the President's own party in Congress are treating this bill like an afterthought. We'd be more inclined to look at this so-called jobs bill if the President's own staff and members of his own party in Congress started taking it a little more seriously themselves. Now, second, I'd remind the President that the people of Kentucky and Ohio have heard this kind of thing before. Don't forget, the President made the same promises when he was selling his first stimulus. It's a message he brought to Ohio repeatedly. Here's what he said 2 years ago this week at a stop in Warren, Ohio. Quote, "All across Ohio and all across the country, rebuilding our roads and our bridges, that's what the Recovery Act has been all about." Now, the Recovery Act is the stimulus bill, the first one. Yet 2.5 years later, what do we have to show for it? Politically connected companies like Solyndra ended up with hundreds of millions of dollars provided by the taxpayers, and bridges like the one the President is attending today still need to be fixed. It's worth noting, in fact, that this one company blew through more taxpayer money than the first stimulus allocated for every road and bridge in the entire state of Kentucky combined. Now, the President told Ohioans and Kentuckians the first stimulus would keep unemployment below 8% as well. Yet 2.5 years later, unemployment in both states is still above 9%. So we've heard these promises before, and I don't think the President should expect anybody to fall for them again. I mean, how many stimulus bills do we have to pass before these bridges get fixed? How many? How many Solyndras do we have to finance? How much money do we have to waste before the President makes good on the promises that he has already made? If a bridge needs fixing, by all means, let's fix it. But don't tell us we need to pass a $500 billion stimulus bill and accept job-killing tax hikes to do it. Don't tell the people of Kentucky they need to finance every turtle tunnel and solar panel company on some bureaucrat's wish list in order to get their bridges fixed. And don't patronize us by implying that if we pass the second stimulus, that bridges will get fixed right away. The American people heard the same thing when the administration was selling the first stimulus, only to turn on their television sets 2.5 years later to see the President having a big laugh over the fact that all these shovel-ready projects weren't quite as shovel-ready as they thought they were. So I would suggest, Mr. President, that you think about ways to actually help the people of Kentucky and Ohio instead of how you can use their roads and bridges as a backdrop for making a political point. If you're truly interested in helping our state, if you really want to help our state, then come back to Washington and work with Republicans on legislation that will actually do something to revive our economy and create jobs and forget the political theater. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. Senator from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to address the Palestinian efforts to gain statehood at the United Nations, all of that occurring this week. As most of us are aware, Palestinian Authority President Abbas has signaled that he intends to ask the United Nations for acceptance as a full member state. Now, several of my colleagues, and I might add from both sides of the aisle, have expressed grave concern over this Palestinian initiative. President Obama has indicated that if this initiative is brought to a vote before the Security Council, the United States plans to veto it. I support that. However, even if the veto occurs, President Abbas may then choose to ask the General Assembly to upgrade Palestinian status to that of a non-voting observer state. If allowed to become a non-voting observer state, Palestinians could then participate on UN committees and bring allegations against Israel to the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. Recognizing a Palestinian state in this manner could also lead to further isolation of Israel within the Middle East. And these are outcomes that we simply can't tolerate. Israel, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is a stalwart friend and ally of the United States. They share our core values as a nation. They are a thriving democracy in a part of the world where democracies are very hard to find. And importantly, they stand strong with us in the battle against international terrorism. Thus, it is imperative, it is absolutely imperative that we stand with Israel and do everything we can to send a very clear and straightforward message. That message is this: the United States stands with our friends, and we will not allow an international organization to undermine this important and valued friend. Congress has been very clear on this imperative. Our strong bipartisan commitment was reinforced earlier this summer when both the Senate and the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed resolutions reaffirming the United States' commitment to direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The resolutions included opposition to this Palestinian bid for UN statehood in a Palestinian government that includes Hamas. In light of this unwavering bipartisan support from Congress, it is crucial that our President continue to make it absolutely clear that the United States stands firm in our opposition to this effort. We have an opportunity, and we must signal to the rest of the world that a lasting peace, which we all want to achieve, will only result from direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not through parliamentary procedure at some international organization. While the United States supports a two-state solution, we will not tolerate actions by international organizations to drive a wedge into the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Although President Abbas claims this initiative is a peaceful approach to resolving the conflict, the Palestinian Authority has refused time and time again to come to the negotiating table and to deal directly with Israel, setting up roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. President Abbas has demanded preconditions that have not applied to previous negotiations. This bid for UN statehood also violates the 1993 Oslo peace agreements signed by the Palestinian Authority, which require the peace process to continue through direct negotiations. The UN statehood bid is counterproductive to a two-state solution, as it will further damage Israel's confidence in the Palestinian Authority as a legitimate negotiating partner. But unfortunately, President Abbas' intention to form a unity government with Hamas does not signal support or pursuit of a lasting peace. Hamas has made its intentions clear, that they have no intention of ending attacks on Palestinians or Israelis working toward a two-state solution. Let me be very clear. If the Palestinian Authority continues to associate with Hamas and refuses to negotiate directly with Israel, of course there's consequences. I can assure you that the Senate and the House of Representatives will stand together to make our disapproval known. U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority is not on cruise control. Congress will not walk away from supporting an appropriate way forward in the peace process that respects the equal and inalienable rights of all people. We cannot stand idly by while others attempt to use the United Nations not to bring about peace, but to undermine our closest ally and friend. As President Obama and his administration continue efforts to resolve this issue before it is brought up to the Security Council, I ask them to do all they can to relay the disapproval of Congress in what President Abbas is trying to do, and to stand without equivocation, shoulder to shoulder with our friend, the State of Israel. It is our best chance of bringing peace to the region. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
We're currently in a quorum call and in morning business.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And I would like to speak for just 5 or 10 minutes here. And my understanding is we may still be in the Republican time, but they've allowed me to speak now. Mr. President, I've heard from many Arkansans and businesses, particularly small businesses, which are struggling to meet an increasing regulatory burden. Each year, federal agencies issue more than 3,000 final rules, many of which have significant economic impact. In Executive Order 13563, President Obama emphasized that our regulatory system should promote, quote, economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation. I agree. We need a 21st century regulatory system that promotes future prosperity. However, there are some rules where that goal appears to have been ignored, and as a result, our economy suffers. Experience suggests that improvements in the regulatory process are necessary to ensure that all agencies pay close attention to the impact their regulatory actions have on jobs and on the economy. For example, the EPA is currently considering more stringent regulations of dust as part of the National Ambient Air Quality. From county roads to farm fields, dust is an unavoidable reality in rural areas. Imposing strict dust regulations on these communities would hurt family farmers and rural economies across Arkansas and our nation. Another example comes from a county judge in Arkansas. He was rightly concerned about a regulation stemming from the Bush administration that would have cost municipalities and counties and states across the country tens of millions of dollars to replace their street signs. The burden of paying for hundreds of thousands of new signs at costs ranging anywhere from $30 to $110 would have fallen to state and local governments, which that means state and local taxpayers. Fortunately, as part of the administration's review of regulations, Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood has decided that a specific deadline for replacing street signs makes no sense, and that local and state transportation agencies are best equipped to determine when they need to replace these signs in the course of their daily work. In his executive order, President Obama remarked that the regulatory system, quote, must identify and use the best, most innovative, and least burdensome tools for achieving regulatory ends. Last month, Cass Sunstein, the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, wrote in the Wall Street Journal that cabinet secretaries were instructed to minimize regulatory costs, avoid imposing excessive regulatory burdens, and prioritize regulatory actions that promote economic growth and job creation. I applaud the administration's new directive. One difference in what the administration is doing versus what we're doing in the Portman-Pryor legislation is that the President is looking retrospectively. He's doing a review of regulations that are on the books now, which is good. I welcome that. But the Portman-Pryor legislation will be prospective. It'll go forward, and we'll talk about that more as we go. I think it is time that Congress reviewed several of the laws that form the basis of our federal regulatory system. We need to find ways to make these laws more fair, reasonable, and effective in meeting the dual challenges of protecting the public while making our economy stronger and more competitive. That is why I've teamed up with Senator Portman on this important legislation. Done right, I believe regulatory reform can lead to better, cheaper, faster rulemaking. Specifically, agencies should, 1, propose or adopt a regulation only when the benefits justify the cost. 2, write regulations so that they impose the least burden on society. And 3, in choosing among alternative regulatory approaches, select those that strike the right balance between minimizing costs and maximizing benefits. Portman-Pryor amends the Administrative Procedures Act to place greater emphasis on early engagement between agencies and parties subject to high-impact rules costing $1 billion or more per year, in major rules costing $100 million or more. These expensive rules are where our focus should be. In fact, as an historical footnote, the Administrative Procedures Act was written in 1946 and has not really been revised and updated since that time. So now that it's 65 years old, I think it's time to look at it and update it. Portman-Pryor makes better use of 2 existing regulatory tools. It requires an advance notice of proposed rulemaking for high-impact and major rules to enable agencies to solicit written data, views, or arguments from interested parties. Second, although the Administrative Procedures Act already allows for formal hearings, agencies rarely use this option. Portman-Pryor requires an agency to conduct a formal rulemaking hearing for high-impact rules and, in some cases, major rules, so that data and information can be debated on the record. Here again, on the record. We're trying to make this process more transparent. Portman-Pryor strikes a balance between minimizing cost and maximizing benefits. The bill makes clear that the agencies are encouraged to choose the least costly alternative that would achieve the objectives of the statute or authorizing the rule. However, the bill also makes clear that the agency may choose a more costly rule so long as it does 2 things. 1, explains why it's done so based on policy concerns addressed by the statute authorizing the rule, and 2, shows that the added benefits are greater than added cost, which is, by definition, a push toward maximizing benefits. Today, the length of rulemaking varies widely from a few months to several years. After this reform, times will still vary in about the same amount, but the final rule should be more stable and more credible. The principal goal of Portman-Pryor is that the bill may shorten the rulemaking process because the final rule will be based on more sound, thorough information, and that fewer high-impact and major rules will be vacated by courts and sent back to the agency. Finally, the bill reinforces that agencies must access the costs and benefits of their rules. However, the bill requires the administrator of OIRA to establish guidelines so that cost-benefit analysis can be commensurate with economic impact of the rule. Regulatory reform is not an exciting subject, I know, but it is vitally important to our nation's economic recovery. I look forward to working with Senator Portman on this important legislation, and I also look forward to working with other colleagues to try to get them interested and possibly co-sponsoring in helping us get this through the process. And my final point is this before I sit down. This is a piece of legislation that not only is bipartisan, but it's bicameral. We have 2 members of the U.S. House of Representatives that announced this legislation with us today. Lamar Smith, who's chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Colin Peterson, who's the ranking member on the Agriculture Committee in the House. So it's rare when we get bipartisan, bicameral legislation coming in this Congress. So I sincerely hope that I'll have colleagues on both sides of the aisle that will look at this legislation. I hope that we will get broad bipartisan support and we'll be able to move it through the committees and get it to the floor in a timely fashion. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.